Ladies and gentlemen, science predicts eclipses. It calculates whether a certain bridge will collapse. It calculates how long it will take that a certain substance decays. Some people concluded from this that science can predict every event. And that relates to a certain philosophical doctrine about every event and its relationship to the laws of nature. In the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes put forward that doctrine without the reference to the laws of nature, because that wasn't his topic at the time. And he, for purely philosophical reasons, came up with a certain view about how every event comes into being. And note that this is a purely philosophical exercise. That is, he didn't do any empirical work, not even much thinking about what actually happens in the world, but he sat down, as philosophers do that, as we say, in an armchair and thought, well, what is it for an event to come about? So if an event comes about, then it was caused. And if it did come about, then its cause must have been complete. So there was a series of events that had to come into the right place so that the causing could take place. So if the event took place, then the cause was complete. We conclude that from the fact that it did occur, otherwise it wouldn't have occurred. Now, if the cause was complete, then, Hobbes is reasoning, then it necessitated its effect, because if the cause was complete, why should the effect not come into being? And the result of that is a doctrine that has very far-reaching consequences, and it's this doctrine which he expresses as follows: whatsoever effects are hereafter to be produced shall have a necessary cause. By that he means what we call today a sufficient cause, that is one that necessitates its effect. So that all the effects that have been or shall be produced have their necessity in things antecedent. Have their necessity in things antecedent means that they were necessitated, determined by preceding events. That is determinism as we today understand it. Every event is necessitated causally by preceding events. That view is more famously attributed to Laplace, but we find this very clear formulation of it already slightly earlier in Hobbes. Now, the consequences of that view are very grave. Note that what one can do with philosophical reasoning, I would say, if it goes wrong. So there is somebody thinking in his armchair what it means that an event comes into being. Now, what's the consequence of this? The consequence of this is, as Hobbes himself observes, let's start with thinking about our own actions. Well, it means that my own actions, my raising my arm, or even my giving this talk, also were necessitated by preceding events. So in a way, he could have predicted, by just looking at all the particles in the universe, what I was about to say in this very talk, with certain epistemological additional assumptions, but at least it was fixed already then. And that's a very far-reaching consequence indeed, because it implies, first of all, that we don't have, well, what we usually call free will, at least. And I mean, it means, whatever you mean by free will, it means that our actions are not the way we usually tend to think about them. We usually tend not to think that what I'm saying right now in this talk was determined by what happened 5 minutes ago or 5 years ago. We think, well, the speaker did some reasoning, he took some notes, and he has some ideas, but thinking of that as being necessitated by preceding events isn't quite how we usually think about it. But Hobbes says, well, for philosophical reasons, just by thinking alone, I can tell you all events that happen were necessitated by preceding events. And that means that there is no free will in the sense of an action where we could afterwards say, well, he did this, but he could at the same point have acted differently. That's excluded with that understanding of determinism. So he just made he got a big result just by reasoning about what it means for an event to occur. He found out we don't have free will. And there is another thing. He found out this way that there are no miracles in this way, because Jesus rising from the dead isn't the sort of thing that matter would have produced. it's not the kind of thing, because usually dead bodies stay dead. And that's not challenged by Christians. What Christians are challenging is, well, usually they stay dead, but God can intervene to raise a man from the dead. And he did things like that. Now, that's excluded by that doctrine, because that Jesus rose from the dead, that event of rising from the dead, was not predetermined by preceding events. Now, Hobbes just ruled that out by a mere philosophical exercise of thinking. So, that doctrine of determinism, which came up through Hobbes, has two severe consequences, which are both lethal for Christianity. First, there is no free will. Second, there are no miracles. In case you wonder about free will, what's the connection between free will and Christianity? Well, first let me mention there is, of course, some debate, in particular among Protestant theologians, whether we do have free will. I suggest that that claim that we do not have free will should not be understood in the sense of physical determinism, but is rather a claim about that God does certain things directly, in particular, that God gives faith by his intervention. So just to put that issue aside, that we are not sidetracked by that. But there are, the obvious connections that Christians nearly always saw between free will and Christianity is Christianity talks a lot about sin. That is, its doctrine makes claims about sin and says sin is everywhere and very strong and the main problem. Now, if there is no free will, it seems as though there isn't that kind of sin. Then what would be the point of God becoming incarnate and dying on the cross and then creating a possibility of salvation and telling human beings to spread this message to other people so that they are saved and do not perish? Now, what would be the point of that if we didn't have free will, if it were as Hobbes has it? So that's why I suggest also in Protestantism, that's not something that Christians can live with. Now, let's carry on just briefly what's the philosophical background here. What Thomas Hobbes formulated, Immanuel Kant took up in a slightly different way. It's always a bit complicated in Kant, but he did propose a principle that he calls the principle of causality, and it says every event is determined by a cause according to constant laws. So as Kant is a bit later, now the laws of nature show up here. So it's the addition, not only is every event predetermined, but it's the laws of nature which prescribes and describes what kinds of events, necessitate what kinds of events. So with that, the deterministic framework becomes even clearer, because it means that if I did a certain action yesterday, say action A, it was not possible that I would do some other action B, because there was a state of the physical universe which determined under laws that event, that action A would occur rather than something else. So Immanuel Kant made this idea very popular and very influential and made it a commonly shared conviction among certain academics and intellectuals in the 19th century. Now, Kant took his ideas partly from David Hume. In David Hume, and that's where we now get to our topic of this session about the laws of nature. David Hume took the Hobbesian doctrine and formulated it in a different way, or formulated a doctrine that's related to it about laws of nature. And Hume argued that laws of nature are regularities of succession. Or there are certain debates, I should add, about how Hume is exactly rightly to be interpreted, but the usual view is roughly that Hume held that laws of nature are regularities of succession. That's an important point now, regularities of succession. What is a regularity of succession? A regularity of succession is a regularity of the type every event of type X is followed by an event of type Y. That's very important to keep in mind. It's about types of events, and he says if there is an event of that type, always follows a certain other event. A certain event of a certain other type, and which types of events are linked in that way, that's written in the laws. That's what the laws are about. And that is a very far-reaching claim, that there are such regularities. All agree that there is some kind of regularity in nature, but the point here is that Hume said the regularity which we sort of see and feel is based on laws of nature being that way. So it's regularities of succession. And that's what we still find in contemporary theories of laws, contemporary philosophical theories of laws. Philosophers are sitting in their armchairs. Actually, they try not just to sit in their armchairs. They try to have an open mind and to be informed. So also when they think about laws, they try to be informed what actual laws there are and what laws are, and at least they should do that. So contemporary theories, philosophical theories of laws, most of them do not agree with Hume in that laws are only regularities of succession. Instead, they say, oh yes, there are these regularities of succession and the laws entail them, but most philosophers say, which is partly correct, I shall argue, what distinguishes these nomic regularities from accidental ones? So most theories of laws today say, well, laws do entail regularities of succession. They fix these regularities of succession, but there is more to them than just the regularity. Because Hume seems to argue that, that regularities of succession exist, and they just happen to exist, and there is no necessity, there is actually no reason why always there is that pattern of events. Hume doesn't say that, and most philosophers today say, well, there needs to be something that links these types of universals, of events. And now, let me just briefly introduce what contemporary theories of laws of nature we have. And the one that's closest to David Hume's theory of laws is the one by the philosopher David Lewis, a very influential metaphysician, and his theory is called a best system analysis, and that means the laws of nature belong all to the true deductive systems with a best combination of simplicity and strength. And now, what does that mean? He means look at all events that happen. I mean, look at what happens in every piece of matter, how things are going there, which processes there are, and then if you do that, if you describe that and describe it in a general pattern, that's what the laws of nature are doing. He says the laws of nature actually are that. They describe what's happening in the universe, and they describe, in a way, what follows what. So it's, in a more complicated way, also regularities of succession. So it's not the simple version that we find in Hume, but he says deductive systems with the best combination of simplicity and strength. So there are various ways to describe what happens, and he says there is a trade-off between simplicity, a simple formula, and strength. So strength means how much that formula explains, how much can be subsumed under it. And he says the laws of nature are that system which is the best description and deductive system, a description of what happens. And that is close to the Humean system because Lewis says there is no additional necessity. There is nothing somehow that fixes or that explains further why things happen in the order they do happen. He just is looking at, well, what do the laws of nature say? And he says, well, we don't need to talk about necessity here, as Hume did. We just can imagine they're just describing what happens when and where. That's what Lewis says the laws are doing. Now, so that is then a theory which is closest to saying laws are just the regularities. Laws are just the regularities. And now I mentioned the theory which says, no, it can't be just regularities. It can't be just that these things happen. There must be a reason why they happen. There must be something that distinguishes there being some pattern of event that just happens to be, and something that's nomic. There must be more to laws than just what's happening, which is, of course, an intuitively plausible thought. So David Armstrong argued that, yes, there are the regularities, but the laws are something that explains the regularities. And he has a theory of universals. Now, in philosophy, universals are properties. Philosophers fought for a long time what properties are. I mean, as general as that, that's what philosophers do. They ask, what is it for a thing to be red or green or have a mass of 1 kilogram? And philosophers, many came to the conclusion that properties are strange things, because two physical things can have the same property. So properties are things that can be in two places at once. The stone is only that stone, and it's not that stone, whereas the properties, there is that property there, born by that stone, and is also born by that ball. So they said, well, properties are something different than substances. They are universals, and that means they are exemplified by various things. So just briefly, properties are universals. And David Armstrong now says, now, these laws of nature, they seem to link properties, because they describe that a certain kind of event, a certain kind of property instantiation, is always followed by a certain other kind of event, by a certain other kind of property instantiation. So he says, well, laws of nature are somehow relationships between properties, between universals. And he says, well, that's what they are. So if there is the property, the universal F, and the property universal G, then a law of nature could be that these two properties are related, so that always when an event has that property F, it has afterwards or simultaneously the property G. So that's, according to Armstrong, the simplest case of a law of nature. So he says there is an explanation why there are the regularities, and that's universals, that link other universals, so relational universals which link monadic universals. And the point of that's why I'm explaining this here, besides informing you that there are these views and that philosophers form theories of laws of nature. The point here is that both these views, which are the two most prominent views of laws of nature today in philosophy, both assume, as Hume does, that laws of nature entail regularities. And that means that as they believe that there are laws of nature, that they all believe that there are regularities. And I will point out in a minute that that's not so obvious that that's the case, because remember, we are talking not about regularities in some general sense, but about regularities of succession. All events of a certain type are always followed by events of a certain other type. And that's quite a strong statement, because it means that if there is an event of type A and it's once followed by an event of type B, if there is at another occasion in another place, again, an event of type A, it's fixed that there will be an event of type B. And that makes the universe a rather rigid place. And I will question whether that's true. And it gets a particularly rigid universe if you add a further assumption, which is usually added, namely that all events are instantiations of such regularities, that all events sort of are referred to, are governed by laws of nature, which say what happens afterwards. Because that then amounts to the view that about every event that happens, the laws say what happens afterwards. Again, that's important. According to this consensus, about every event that occurs, the laws of nature say what happens afterwards. That's why I began in the beginning with pointing out, of course, physics predicts some events, and then the additional step, the philosophical claim, is to claim that all events are of that type. And that's not a trivial step, because it's a rather big claim. It's a claim about everything that happens, and, for example, also our free actions, or our actions, and miracles. Now, I've already mentioned these problems with free actions and with miracles. Let me make this more precise. That's our job as philosophers. at least I'll indicate how we make these things more precise. How can we define free action, and how can we define what a miracle is? What we need for that, in my view, is we need to recognize that there are causal processes. Now, causal processes, that's something like a rolling billiard ball or a tsunami moving towards the coast. These are causal processes. And of course, more generally, there are a lot of causal processes, or somehow, at least where there is non-living matter, you can, however you slice up matter, it's all causal process. It's causal process through and through. Otherwise, things wouldn't persist. So even a simple persisting thing, even this thing continuing to exist, can be, and I think rightly taken to be, a causal process. That is, this thing at time 1 is a cause of that thing at time 2. So causal processes are what relates, at least in many cases, and the cases that are governed by laws, physical objects, physical stuff, physical states of affairs with physical objects at another time, or physical events at another time. So causal processes are what matter does over time. And so they are causal processes, and they have a direction. They have a direction. A rolling billiard ball has a direction, and you feel that when you put your hand there, it hits you. And if there is a tsunami, it has also a direction, and a rather strong one. So causal processes have a direction. That's the basic observation, the basic empirical fact with which I'm beginning here. And with that in place, we can understand a bit better what a miracle is, or more generally, a divine intervention. A divine intervention is an event that occurs instead of an event towards which there was a causal process directed. So causal processes have a direction. A billiard ball is rolling in one direction. And then, in the case of a divine intervention, God brings about an event, either something entirely different, or he just stops the billiard ball, or whatever it is. And that event then is in conflict with the event to which nature would have led. So nature would have led to the ball continuing to roll, and God brought it about that the ball stops. More complicatedly, nature would have had it that the body of Jesus remains dead, but God brought it about that it rose from the dead. So that's generally the idea of what a divine intervention is. Therefore, I think, contrary to some theologians, the term intervention is actually quite suitable. It doesn't mean that he sort of destroys the whole universe or something of that type. No, there is a causal process, and God intervenes by producing a certain event, which is not the one that nature would have produced. That's rather a traditional understanding of miracle, and I think it fits with our ordinary and the biblical understanding of miracle or divine intervention. I should add why the term divine intervention and not just miracle. Well, miracle is a special type of a divine intervention, namely a divine intervention which serves to show somebody something. Or at least it's a visible event. It's something where people see, oh, he was ill or even dead, and now he's alive again. So we can see something special must have happened. Probably God did it. Whereas God could intervene in a way so that nobody can realize, say at the quantum level or in whichever way hidden. Or, of course, God might have intervened at certain points before there were any human beings or any living beings even. He might have intervened during creation. So this would be interventions too, but if God, for example, creates a certain animal just directly, just like that, that would not be a miracle, but just a divine intervention. That's what the terminology at least is. So that's why I use the term intervention as the most general term for the kind of divine action I'm looking at here. Now let's make it yet a bit more precise. What does it mean God brings about that event? Doesn't that have to do with processes too? No. That's a different way how an event can come into being. I call events that come into being through an action, I call them choice events. Choice events means there is an agent, and he, by doing something, something comes into being, an event occurs. so that when the event occurs, it has no preceding cause, contrary to Hobbes. That's where we see the conflict between miracle, free will, and Hobbes's view. A choice event, on my terminology, as an event that has no preceding cause, but was brought about by an agent in an action. A choice event of God, that's what a divine intervention is an event which is brought about by God and has no preceding cause. That means it couldn't have been predicted by consulting the laws of nature. And more generally, a free action, a free human action, for example, or animal for that matter, involves an event which has no preceding cause, but is brought about by the agent. A free action involves an event which has no preceding cause, but is brought about by the agent. Now, note here that we are here talking about events without preceding cause. In philosophy, that's of course controversial, whether there is that kind of free will. I present this to you now, and I argue for it as time allows. I just have to note, of course, other people disagree. In philosophy, there's always disagreement, but that's what I think, how it's best to be understood, and that's how we can understand divine action and human action in a certain similar way. That is to say, although with human action, some people want to say, no, human actions always have preceding causes. For theists, but Christians in particular, I then point out, well, okay, you try to account for human action that way, but at least for divine action, you can't do that because God doesn't have a body. And he also, for example, creating a universe in the first place, that was an event which did not have a preceding cause. It was brought about by God. So at least God is the kind of person who can bring about in an action an event so that that event does not have a preceding cause. It's not the result of a causal process, but it's the result of an action. It is his choice. It is his choice. So the picture is God or another person acts. That's this little choice is, that's the core of the action. That's the I did it. I mean, afterwards. When we say afterwards, I did it, you refer to that little oomph where the action took place. And that's where I say, where there is a choice event which doesn't have a preceding cause. So I'm saying Christians and all theists need to assume, at least for God, that there are choice events, and I'm suggesting that it's most reasonable to conceive human action in a parallel way. Now again, let me spell out with a bit more precision how then that view of laws of nature is in conflict with free will as well as with miracles. Now, we said that a miracle is a choice event by God, which then stops a causal process. It's an event which occurs instead of an event to which a process would have led. So a choice event is a Z event, an event of type Z, which follows an X event instead of a Y event, when on other occasions X events are followed by Y events. So that just means that when there is only matter, at least in certain circumstances, when an event of type X occurs, it's followed by an event of type Y. So when a billiard ball is rolling, it continues rolling. So that rolling before a certain time can be the X event, and then it just continues. So there are certain regularities of that type to some extent. But a miracle is an event where, at least on that occasion, something else happens than what on other occasions, when there was no action, no intervention, happened. Therefore, here it is not caused, that Z event is not caused by X. It has no preceding cause at all. And then if it's true what we said before, that there are these regularities of succession and that every event is a part of such a regularity of succession, so for every event it's prescribed what kind of event will follow afterwards, then there can't be miracles, because a miracle is exactly that while on other occasions when nobody intervened, a certain type of event happened. When God intervened, something else happens. Dead people stay dead, but on that occasion a dead man rose from the dead. Or the stone in front of the grave usually stays where it is when there is no wind, no nothing, no physical causes. In that case, the stone moved because God or an angel of God moved the stone. So that's why the idea that laws entail regularities of succession, and there are regularities of succession, and every event is an instance of irregularities of succession, why that excludes the occurrence of miracles. And through that is just plain outright denying Christianity, because Christianity is based on miracles, first of all on the resurrection of Jesus and on other miracles too, the virgin birth or the various healings that Jesus did or the apostles did. So that doctrine of determinism, as well as the theories of laws of nature, which entail, according to which laws entail regularities, they all are in tension with Christianity. And the same now is not only true not only for divine actions, for divine intervention, but it's true for human actions too, and for animal actions, for that matter. So free actions are excluded by this regularity view too, because also human actions would be, human free actions, at least in some cases, that is in the case when we make a conscious decision, perhaps contrary to a temptation, at least in those cases where we just where we do not just go along with the flow or with the brain. If we have free will, at least sometimes our actions are so that we place choice events so that something else happens than what nature or our brain would have brought about. So free actions are excluded too by the regularity view. There are, of course, certain modifications that some philosophers of religion have made in order to accommodate that, but on the standard view of laws of nature, miracles as well as free actions are excluded. So there is not even limited free will. Or everybody agrees also in the debate about predestination, everybody agrees that human beings do not have perfect free will. That's a straw man if somebody just discusses that. Everybody agrees that our will is limited, our free will is limited because we all have all sorts of inclinations and weaknesses and temptations. So we are always, if we have free will, we are struggling, and the amount of free will that we have is depending on many things, also on our previous behavior. We can strengthen our will through doing the good thing. It becomes easier to do the good thing. And by resisting a temptation, next time the temptation may be weaker. So free will is a matter of degree. We are just talking about no free will at all or some limited free will. That's what we are talking about in the case of humans. So I've mentioned that already. Why is free will, human free will, relevant for Christianity? It seems as though without free will there is no sin and there is no temptation. There is no reason for the commission to call people to convert. It seems, of course, some people have tried to tell the story a little different, but it seems the most reasonable thing to say. And besides that, if there is no free will, it seems very hard to find a solution for the argument from evil. That is, the argument from evil in the world, if one were to deny free will, becomes a very, very strong argument. That's at least my view. I just mentioned why that's relevant. And as a matter of fact, most Christians have a firm free will, at least in one form or place or the other. So, where are we now? We have discovered that the contemporary laws of nature all entail according to the contemporary laws of nature, the laws of nature entail regularities of succession. So they all entail the worldview that, according to which it's always fixed when there is an event of a certain type that there will be an event of a certain other type, and that excludes free will and miracles. Now, where does that leave us? What's the alternative to that view? Is that view correct? And I want now, in the remaining time, briefly suggest why that's wrong. Why that's wrong. And the solution begins with looking at an actual law of nature. Now, what philosophers do wrong is that they often just think about what a law of nature is and don't look at actual laws of nature. As ridiculous as that may sound, they don't even look at a simple law which they learned at high school, for example, the law of gravity. Now, when you look at the law of gravity, and here I begin to suggest an alternative theory of the laws of nature, when you look at the law of gravity, what does it say? It says that there is, in a certain kind of situation, a certain kind of force. The law of gravity says that in situations of a certain kind, there are forces of a certain kind. Now, that's not the picture that we are getting from these other theories of the laws of nature. Why is that? Because what are forces? Forces are something that can be counteracted. Forces can be counteracted, for example, by other processes. Now that, I think, tells us, of course, everybody recognizes that processes sometimes collide. So there is one ball rolling and another ball is coming from the other side, so they collide. So the process goes another way than it would have gone without the other process coming along. Now, if processes are that way, if their nature is thus that it's possible that another process can deviate or stop them, then also something else could stop them. For example, a human agent, a human free action, or a divine action. So I'm concluding from the fact that the laws of nature say, the law of gravity in that case, which I used as an example, that they say that what the forces there are, forces are the kind of thing that can be counteracted, and they can be counteracted not only by other physical processes, but also by agents, human or divine. How is that justified? First, from what the law says, that there is the F. There is not a regularity of succession written in the law of nature. So I think it's actually very simple what the correct law of nature is, but philosophers, for some reasons which have to do with background assumptions, didn't take laws to be what they appear to be. But I'm suggesting we should just take in philosophy and in general laws to be what they appear to be, namely statements about what forces there are in what kinds of situations. Now, and then from forces, we see that forces can be counteracted, and then when we compare that, what we know about the actual processes, it fits that, because we observe that the processes that there are in this world are not like Hobbes described them. Because according to the Hobbesian picture, causal processes would have to be these non-stoppable movements through time, but they aren't that way. We see that the causal processes of this world can be stopped. I wanted to bring a tennis ball just to illustrate that a ball can be stopped, and that is what's happening in a free action as well as in a miracle. What's happening in a free action and in a miracle is not more problematic from this point of view, is not more problematic, is not more or less incompatible with the laws of nature than when a billiard ball is hit by another billiard ball. Because that happening shows that the processes of this world, of this physical world, are stoppable. And that's coherent or is supported by what the laws actually say, namely that there are forces. Now, we can go into a bit more detail what the forces are. There is an interesting question about the relationship between the law statements that contain the F and statements that are differential equations. Now, let's stick with the forces, because I think what's properly called laws of nature is that statement, are these kinds of statements which contain the F and not the differential equations. The differential equations are something else which we can talk about in the discussion. But the laws of nature state that there is a certain F. Now let's apply that to miracles. What does that mean for a miracle? What does that mean if God moves a stone from the grave? Let's assume God did it directly without the angel. It means, well, question, what do the laws of nature say about the stone? They say that there are certain forces. They say that there is a certain force of gravity pulling the stone down and so on. And what do the laws of nature predict? Well, they sort of predict that the stone stays where the stone is. But more precisely, how are predictions to be formulated? Predictions derived from the laws of nature are to be formulated with a certain conditional clause. They need to say, this and this will happen if nothing else is acting on the things in question. So I repeat that because it's a central claim. Predictions derived from the laws of nature cannot be unconditional. They need to contain the conditional clause, the limiting clause, if nothing else is acting on the things in question. So what does that mean for the stone? That means the laws of nature the laws of nature are not primarily there to say what happens when. The laws of nature are only about what forces there are. Now, question, does God abolish the force in the case of moving a stone? No reason to believe that. I mean, it's a matter of debate whether he could, but it doesn't, there is no reason to think that. It's more plausible to believe that the forces were still there, that the stone still had its mass, and the mass was still pulling the stone down. God just moved the stone nevertheless. It's absolutely clear, we have a clear grip of what's going on there. It's the superposition either of forces, or it's just a force being overridden by something else than a force, namely an agent. So, what's the result? The result is that miracles do not violate the laws, because the laws of nature say which forces there are in a certain kind of situation, and there is no reason to believe that God in a miracle abolishes the force. So the conclusion is that the contemporary theories of laws are in fact, at least in tension with Christianity. What I mean is that some philosophers of religion made some theories to bridge the problem, but as it stands, the standard view, the contemporary theories of laws are in serious tension with Christianity because they exclude free will as well as miracles. But if we start to develop the correct theory of laws, that problem disappears entirely, and we can just state that the laws are about what forces there are in what kinds of situations, and that in a miracle, God in no way violates the laws of nature.